My name is Jared Garceau, and I'm attorney at the law offices of Lewis Thomason in Knoxville. One of the areas of the law that I practice in is business contracts and business formation. And a question that I commonly get from clients is, what structure is the most appropriate for my business? So the purpose of this presentation is to give a high-level overview of the different business structures available under Tennessee law. The most basic form of business structure is the sole proprietorship. And for all intents and purposes, a sole proprietorship is considered one and the same as its owner. It only has one owner, and there's no legal distinction or separation between the business and the owner. And so, of course, that means if there's ever a lawsuit and a judgment against the business, then the owner is personally responsible for the judgment with the owner's personal assets. The assets of the business and the liabilities of the business are also the assets and liabilities of the owner. While there's no legal liability protection for a sole proprietorship, a business can always protect against liability by obtaining insurance. And so even sole proprietorships can get insurance policies. The problem, of course, is that insurance is not always going to be enough. If you're the owner of a piece of property and someone falls on the piece of property and breaks their leg, or if you have a situation where you have multiple people who are injured, you can quickly exceed the limits of a general $1 million insurance policy. And so without any legal liability protection at the entity level, anything that insurance doesn't cover, you're going to be personally covering as the owner of the sole proprietorship. There are some benefits to a sole proprietorship. Most notably, there's a low administrative burden, which means you're not going to have to file annual reports to the state of Tennessee. You're not going to have to pay separate state level franchise and excise taxes for the entity. But the lack of a liability shield is often enough for this type of business structure to not be desirable. The next step up on the continuum of business structures is a partnership. And a partnership is considered to be in existence in the eyes of the law if four things are established. And the acronym for this is TUBOP. You have two or more individuals operating a business as co-owners with the intent of making a profit. Whether or not you intend to create a partnership, if these four things exist, then you have a partnership under Tennessee law, a general partnership. And a general partnership is very similar to a sole proprietorship. It just has more than one owner. A general partnership also, like a sole proprietorship, has no legal liability shield. So the debts and liabilities of the partnership are also the debts and liabilities of each individual partner. The owners of a partnership are, of course, referred to as partners. Unlike a sole proprietorship, a partnership is considered a separate legal entity, which means it has to file its own tax returns, but there is no entity level taxation. Any income of the entity that's reported on the entity's tax return passes through to the individual partners and is taxed at the individual partner level. A general partnership also is not required to file franchise and excise tax returns or pay franchise and excise taxes to the state. There are several default rules that apply under the law to partnerships. So the profits and losses of the partnership are divided equally or split equally among the partners. The management rights are split equally among the partners, and the partners owe certain fiduciary duties to each other and to the partnership by default. These things can be altered or modified through a written partnership agreement amongst the partners. The next step up on the business structure continuum is a limited liability company. This is generally the most popular type of business structure. And that's, of course, because of the liability shield or liability protection that's afforded by law to the owners of the limited liability company. It's the same liability protection that you would have in a corporation, but it's less of an administrative burden to maintain an LLC than it is to maintain a corporation. That's why it's the desirable entity. The liability protection provides that the members of the LLC, who are the owners, are not personally responsible for the debts and liabilities of the entity, as long as the business formalities are followed. So in order to properly maintain the business as a separate entity with separate liabilities, you're going to have to ensure that the entity has a separate bank account from each of its individual owners' bank accounts. The entity will file separate tax returns. It will file reports annually to the Tennessee Secretary of State. Formal actions of the members need to be documented, and the members need to hold an annual meeting. So there are a number of different actions that need to be taken in order to maintain that level of separation between the entity and its owners. If the entity does not properly maintain that separation, then the corporate veil can be pierced. And what that means is a court can disregard the liability shield and say this entity is really just a sham. It's one and the same as its owners, and therefore the owners could be held liable for the debts and liabilities of the entity. That's very difficult to prove under Tennessee law, but if the entity is not maintaining a separate bank account, et cetera, then it can be done. So it's very important to maintain those business formalities. An LLC is formed by filing articles of organization with the Tennessee Secretary of State. It's not required, but it's often advisable that the individual owners enter into what's called an operating agreement between themselves, which provides the way that the management is going to be handled, the way that finances are going to be handled, voting rights, et cetera, among the members. An LLC is required to pay franchise and excise taxes to the state of Tennessee. And the LLC also is required to file its own separate tax return with the federal government on income taxes, in addition to the members each filing their own. But like a partnership, any income that's reported at the entity level tax return passes through and is only taxed at the individual owner level. And then finally, the most complex form of business structure is the corporation. Corporation's owners are referred to as shareholders, and the shareholders of a corporation, just like the members of an LLC, have a liability shield as long as the corporate formalities are maintained. A corporation is generally more burdensome to maintain than an LLC is. The corporation is going to have a board of directors, and the board of directors has fiduciary duties to the shareholders and to the corporation. And the board of directors is going to meet regularly, document all of the formal approvals and consents and actions that the board is taking on behalf of the corporation. And that just involves more work than what's required at the LLC level. A corporation is also going to be subject to double taxation, meaning income is taxed both at the corporate level and then again at the shareholder level, unless the corporation elects S corporation status. But that requires additional work and, again, additional administrative burden. A corporation is formed by filing a charter with the state of Tennessee, and generally the corporation will then create a set of bylaws that governs how the corporation is going to be managed, when the board is going to meet, when the shareholders are going to meet, et cetera. So that concludes the different entities that I'm going to talk about today. There are additional entities available under Tennessee law. There are limited liability partnerships, there are limited partnerships, there's nonprofit entities, but the four that we've talked about today are the four most common. The final note that I want to leave you on is if you're going to go through the hassle of forming a legal entity like an LLC or a corporation and maintaining its separation, then make sure that you're signing contracts and signing documents on behalf of the entity in the proper way. Because if you sign a contract that's intended to be an LLC contract, but you sign it as an individual, then despite your liability shield, you can still be personally held liable because you've personally signed the contract. So this is the format that you should generally try to follow when you're signing contracts on behalf of your company. And I'd like to thank you for watching this presentation. I'm always happy to take a phone call or get an email if you need any help with your business needs. Thank you.